All right. All right. So, as I said this morning during the introduction, my name is Samantha Daniel. I'm the water and cropping systems educator for Perkins Chase and Dundee. But my background is in entomology, and I spent a lot of time in Dr. Julie Peterson's lab as a student and as her technician. So I got to spend a lot of time with Western bean cutworm. Most of what we did in the lab was Western bean cutworm and corn, because we know it's a significant pest in corn in the state. However, I just um it can also be an issue in dry beans. So, quick outline. So, a little background info, talk a little bit about the current status of the pest in dry beans, what kind of damage it does, and a little bit about yield versus quality loss, scouting, trapping, and thresholds for Western bean, and then management. So, a little history of this pest. So, Western bean cutworm, scientific name is Striacosta albicosta. It's a native noctuid moth. It's univoltine, which means it has one generation per year. And the annual flight is anywhere from very late June to the very earliest part of September. And it's going to really depend on what area of the country you're looking at. It was first described as a pest of dry beans in Colorado in 1915. So it was described as a pest of dry beans even before it was known as a pest of corn. So it was described as a pest of corn in 1957 in Idaho. So the range of Western bean cutworm. So the Western states and the Great Plains on this map shaded in that gray, that's its historic range. And then after about the year 2000, it spread to parts of the Midwest, the Northeast, and into Canada. So that's what the yellow area is on the map. So regular economic infestations in dry beans do happen in Ontario, Canada, and in Michigan. And that's regular economic infestations. Oftentimes, every year they're dealing with this pest causing damage in dry beans in those areas. Here and other parts of its range, it's more of an occasional, sometimes type of pest. Really, you really have to have kind of a perfect storm of different things coming together. So basically, the timing of the corn, the stage of the corn, the timing and stage of the bean crop, and then the flight of the moth. So when Western bean cutworm does infest dry beans, this is what the life cycle would look like. So in late July into August, when the corn has already tasseled and pollen shed is complete, you get you get the moths entering dry beans, laying eggs, and then the eggs will hatch. And those little neonate larvae will feed on the blossoms, and they'll feed a little bit on the leaves of the dry bean plant. As they mature, they will then, through August and September, they'll then start to feed on the pods. So that's when you start getting that pod damage. So neonate larvae, when they first hatch, they're feeding on that leaf tissue. Then they move to flowers and some of the small developing pods. Once they hit that third instar, kind of halfway through their larval development, they will begin to feed on the pods at night or during cloudy days, and then they'll retreat to the ground during the day. So it makes it pretty much impossible to scout for these guys in dry beans. Another thing too is when they're climbing back up the plant during feeding time at night or during cloudy days, they might feed on a different pod each night. So single pods may only have one or two beans that have been fed on, but you can have multiple pods on a plant that have damage from these larvae. A lot of times, too, the damage is patchy in the fields. So it's something that if you're looking for pod damage, you have to make sure you're looking across the field and not in just certain areas. So yield loss can occur from a reduction in the number of pounds harvested, but the primary issue is quality loss. And that comes from the entrance of fungus or bacteria. You can also get discoloration and then partially eaten, shriveled, or moldy beans. So as we see in this photo on the right, it's showing you beans from 3 separate pods. And you see each group, there's only one bean that's been fed on. So, but still, that's 3 pods that have been compromised by larval feeding. And then that image shows the small hole at the top of that pod from feeding damage. It's a lot easier to notice the feeding holes after desiccation once the plant has dried down a little bit. So now, as I mentioned, scouting for Western bean cutworm in dry beans, definitely not like corn. It's really not something you can do. Eggs are laid on the underside of leaves deep within the canopy. The larvae, they're within that canopy. They might even be inside the flower. So this image shows a little larvae actually inside the bloom. So I don't know about you, but I'm not going to go look at every little flower on the plant and open it up to look for a larva. So a better thing to do is to scout adjacent cornfields instead, to give you an idea of what's going on in the area. Dry beans may be at risk if the adjacent corn reaches threshold, and once that adjacent corn matures and is no longer as attractive to the female moths for oviposition. Another thing we can do is use pheromone traps. So this is something that this year, a lot of us across the state have done as a project with Dr. Julie Peterson, is we have trapped for Western bean cutworm. And we set these up in cornfields and dry bean fields. And for dry bean fields, you want to have 2 traps per field at opposite ends of the field. And then it helps you to monitor the moth flight, which will help to estimate your scouting time and infestation potential. So scouting for pod feeding damage is good to do 10 to 20 days after peak flight. Peak flight is determined by what's in your trap. The trap count, once that starts to go down, then you know you've reached peak flight. These these bucket traps can be used to determine risk, but you cannot use these alone to determine insecticide application decisions. You have to scout as well. You need more information because a lot of times you can get a ton of moths in these pheromone traps, but the adjacent field may not have any pressure. So if you're looking at your traps from your dry bean field, if you've got less than 1,200 average per trap, it's low risk. 12 to 1,700 moths per trap is moderate risk, and then over 1,700 per trap is high risk. So this is a little bit, lots of numbers and stuff. This is actually our trapping data from this year, and I'm just going to highlight a few. So 25th of July, that was the peak flight for Dundee County. I had 2 moth traps at a pinto bean field. And you can see on that date, one trap had 1,929 moths. Another one had over 2,200. So that's well beyond that 1,700 point. 1st of August, that was the peak flight for the Perkins County black-eyed pea traps that I had. And again, both of them well beyond that 1,700. I've looked in those fields. I haven't found anything. So it's just kind of interesting. We don't really know, don't have a lot of hardcore data, as even though we're collecting this many moths at these traps along dry bean fields, what are the moths actually doing? Are they really still just going to that corn? What's going on? And then you can see a the accumulated numbers. Some of my Perkins County traps, one's over 4,000, the other one's over 5,000. So that's quite a few moths. So it's going to be interesting. I'm working with that grower just to see like if there's damage, after desiccation, once it's easier to go in and see pod feeding, see what's going on there. So these images also show what those bucket traps can look like when they're full or almost full of moths. It's quite a few. So it's kind of wild how many Western bean cutworm we can get out of those. So yeah,
For those, you had those locations that didn't quite line up by county, but you had a couple that were in Gary for corn and also for beans and other places. Are those paired by field side by side or is it spread out?
it's spread out. Yeah,
Okay.
it's spread out. Um, and that's something I think I want to work with Julie on before she leaves, is maybe an on-farm research project for next year to kind of monitor neighboring cornfields to dry bean fields just to determine what is going on, what is the situation, because we don't really have hardcore data on that. All we have is just kind of incidental stories and whatnot. So that's a good question. Management. So generally, insecticide applications, you definitely don't want to apply before pod development because that's just premature, it's ineffective. That's not going to help anything, but application might be necessary once you detect pod damage. And if you're about 10 to 21 days after that peak flight, because you want to target the highest number of emerged larvae as possible. You also want to make sure you're maximizing the spray coverage on pods. So that leads me to that question. What is the situation in Nebraska? We know that Western bean cutworm is causing economic damage in places like Ontario and Michigan. We have the population of Western bean cutworm here. So what's going on with the beans here? Why aren't they? Well, we don't want them in there, right? We don't want them getting in our beans, but what is the kind of the dynamic of, is it just the corn is sufficient for them? So this is that monitoring. Let's see if this will work. It will if I'm going to show you guys. So when we were done with collecting